of CAS Philippines. Stefan, please.
Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, dear Hermann Kraft. On behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the first of several events in the context of the 5th Katipunan Conference 2020, entitled COVID-19 in a Strategic Environment, Change and Continuity. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a German political foundation with a Christian democratic orientation. We are working in 107 offices all over the world with national and regional programs. The Philippines were one of the first countries where the foundation started its work in Asia in 1964. Strengthening of democratic political systems, rule of law, human rights, an inclusive economical system as the social market economy are some of our most important working areas. Another focus of our work, including our office in the Philippines, is questions of international relations and security policy. Because of this focus on international politics and security policy, I'm happy and grateful that we can be a partner at this Katipunan Conference. In these weeks and months, we don't just want to try to come to terms with the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic in a national political context. We all know and experience firsthand to extent to which, yes, brutality, COVID-19 has become an ongoing global challenge about the international consequences and implications. And what better way to do this than the Katipunan Conference? Since 2015, the Katipunan Conference has been a recognized platform for the discussion of foreign and security policy issues in the region and the analysis of the strategic and strategic. To say one thing in advance, it didn't take the COVID-19 pandemic to make this conference exciting this year as well. Too much has happened and changed in recent years. But yes, COVID-19 has dramatically accelerated some of the existing developments while also creating a multitude of new challenges. We should be very realistic, realize that we are currently certainly not in a position to assess and foresee the dramatic changes and effects this pandemic will have. And that doesn't just apply to the actual health sector. All, without exception, all political fields are affected. Economy, labor market, international relations, social affairs, culture, to name just a few. The political system of numerous countries are undergoing a stress test, some of which is existential, and we do not know whether and with what result they will pass this stress test. The system of international relations is also changing. To make it clearer with an example, I was invited to an international conference in Istanbul in March. Topic: China in international politics. This conference had to be cancelled due to COVID-19, and the new invitation is now for March 2021. If it takes place, I will have to change quite a few parts of my original presentation. Not because China's behavior in the region, especially in the South China Sea, has changed. Unfortunately, as we all know, that is not the case, but on the contrary. But precisely this behavior, the continuing disregard of the hard judgment, the massive militarization of the area, the actions of China in Hong Kong, the increasingly massive and military threat to Taiwan, and last but not least, the attempt to rewrite the actual development, especially the pandemic, rejecting responsibility and trying to emerge as a political winner from this global crisis, has triggered a series of counter movements in many parts of the world and has significantly increased the skepticism about Chinese behavior that has been building for years. This is the only way to understand various declarations and measures, not only from important states in the region, but also, for example, from the European Union or some European states. This applies to the assessment and evaluation of China It concerns the support of the Philippines in the international recognition of the judgment from 2016. But this is also evident, for example, from the fact that the German government first adopted a political concept for the Indo-Pacific region a few weeks ago. Debates about decoupling, debates about partial restructuring of globalization have begun. And I'm sure that even if a miracle happened and the virus went away tomorrow, or an effective vaccine was found, these deliberations and debates that were beginning would not end there. They have only just begun and will keep international politics in suspense for years to come. That's why this 5th Katipunan Conference comes at exactly the right time. Southeast Asia is the region in which decisive decisions and developments are taking place that will influence the international balance of power for decades, if not longer. And the Philippines are too important in this region to be able to disengage from this debate and these developments. Because regardless of the central Chinese questions, there are numerous others. How do the states treat each other? How are the different countries in this region dealing with the crisis? How do you understand your role and your responsibilities in the international community and international cooperation? Do facts still count, or are they ignored, concealed, falsely disregarded, twisted and redefined for reasons of power, politics and ideology? Does the international community of states have the institutions, the means and the coordination and coalition potential to defend the law-based international order? Are there forms and possibilities of transnational cooperation in the immediate fight against the crisis, but also its long-term consequences? What role could ASEAN play in this context? What are the domestic and foreign policy consequences for the Philippines? How to deal with it? These facts and questions I have stated are only a tip of the iceberg. And you will notice that even though I have been only in your country, in your beautiful and interesting country for 2 years, it is difficult for me to limit myself to a few comments in connection with this opening of this seminar, but I will limit myself now. And given the impressive lineup of speakers that we have present, namely Dr. Andrew Geo from the Catholic University of America, Dr. Abdul Abiyad from the Asian Development Bank, and Dr. Meli Caballero Anthony from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, I'm confident that these issues will be addressed in an excellent and much more detailed manner. Finally, let me do one more thing. Thank you. I want to express my sincerest gratitude to our cooperation partner, the University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies, under the guidance of Professor Herman Kraft, for co-organizing this event with the CAS Philippines office, and to Rona Villanueva, our responsible program manager for this event in our CAS team. I wish everyone a fruitful discussion ahead. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much for laying out the context of our webinar today. Before we begin our presentations, I would like to inform our attendees that they can use the Q&A button to send your questions for the open forum. Please make sure that you indicate your name and identify the speaker to whom your question is addressed. Our first speaker for today is Dr. Andrew Yeo. He is a professor of politics and director of Asian Studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, and was a Fulbright senior scholar to the University of the Philippines, and is also currently a visiting scholar at the University of the Philippines Department of Political Science. After Dr. Yeo, our second speaker will be Dr. Abdul Abiyad. Dr. Abiyad is director of the Macroeconomic Research Division at the Asian Development Bank, where he works on macroeconomic research and surveillance and on issues relating to infrastructure. And our third speaker, who is joining us from Singapore, is Dr. Meli Caballero Anthony. Dr. Anthony is Professor of International Relations and Head of the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies of the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So now let me ask Professor Yeo to start us off. Andrew, please.
Thank you, Mr. Amador, for that opening, and thank you, Dr. Yost, for providing us a nice context in your introductory remarks about the strategic environment in Asia. I'm really pleased to be here this morning to speak at the 5th Katipunan Conference on Emerging Trends in the Regional Environment, hosted by the Center for Integrative and Development Studies. It's getting me out of my shell. You know, I'm at home most of the time. I'm based in Manila, but it gives me an excuse to just think about what's happening outside of this country. But the panelists were provided a set of guiding questions for us to think about, and I thought I would just start there. And so I wanted to begin by talking about the current strategic environment in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region, and the degree to which the pandemic may have altered the strategic environment. So I'm just going to start off by saying that the strategic environment doesn't look pretty. And it's in large part because of the growing strategic competition between the region's two heavyweights, the United States and China. Now, of course, these two relations were already deteriorating before the pandemic, but as I'll argue in a couple of minutes, and as Dr. Yost had mentioned, that deceleration is, the deterioration is accelerating. So as I mentioned, since the pandemic, the Trump administration had decided to use the pandemic as a weapon against China rather than seek cooperation and rally its allies. Well, it's trying to seek cooperation and also rally its allies and its strategic partners in an effort to contain Chinese influence and leadership aspirations. So on one hand, you see the United States trying to take, or the Trump administration really trying to take advantage of the pandemic situation. But you also see Xi Jinping and the CCP not really backing down either. Instead, they've hedged their bets by predicting that US global leadership is on the wane. The CCP has thus taken steps to consolidate its leadership and power, starting at home and then extending to its regional neighborhood and then globally. This includes tightening rule in areas of contested sovereignty, including Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, and asserting its claims over disputed land borders and maritime space. So rather than using the pandemic to encourage regional and global collective action, both superpowers have instead sown division and tried to use the pandemic for individual gain. And most recently, we heard the Pope criticize the lack of unity or the lack of global cooperation in the face of the pandemic. So in some ways, it's leave it up to the church to discipline or to call out actors and their misbehaviors. So we are seeing this lack of cooperation in a time where cooperation is actually most critical. Now, as I've said, the pandemic hasn't changed the nature of broader strategic competition between US and China, but it has impacted the strategic environment in two significant ways. First, as Dr. Yost mentioned, it's accelerated the pace of US-Sino rivalry in 2020 as both sides used the pandemic to scapegoat the other and consolidate anti-China and anti-US domestic national opinion. And this, of course, has intensified competition. President Trump has referred to the COVID-19 pandemic as the China or the Wuhan coronavirus or the Kung flu. And the Chinese Communist Party's accusations that the virus was started in a US military lab, or its aggressive public relations campaign to demonstrate pandemic diplomacy, is not only further consolidated anti-China, anti-US rhetoric, but it's really made it difficult for these two sides to cooperate. So the pandemic has really accelerated this dynamic that we already had been seeing before 2020. But the second, I think the second impact that the coronavirus has had on the strategic environment is that it's made any potential strategic and economic fallout from the US-China competition much more acute for regional actors. So regional actors from Japan and South Korea and Northeast Asia to ASEAN member states, they're feeling the intensity of this competition much more because of the pandemic. So in addition to spending billions of dollars on COVID-19 relief, regional actors are also concerned about technology and trade and the risks of economic coercion and decoupling from and between the United States and China. So all countries within the region have adopted some form of a hedging or omnidirectional policy to some degree, because so these smaller states, middle powers, they recognize that you have to maintain relations with both China and the United States. But some countries have aligned towards one superpower or the other. And this is where we see the United States trying to shore up the Quad or create something like the Quad Plus, which adds US. So in the Quad, you have the US, Australia, Japan, and India, but now trying to court New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam within the Quad Plus. Or you see other countries like ASEAN member states and South Korea trying not to take sides, but instead develop deeper cooperation among middle powers. So this is a part of South Korea's New Southern Policy strategy. I just want to briefly touch on some sectors. Actually, there's one sector that I'll mention that's been significantly affected because of the pandemic, and I've already mentioned trade and technology. There was an ongoing trade war which neither side could really resolve before the coronavirus. There was issues of intellectual property theft, cybersecurity, and currency manipulation. At least this is what the United States had accused China of well before the pandemic, and it's really driven the ire of US officials. But since the pandemic, the Trump administration decided to go very public and further weaponize these issues, pressuring other countries to make choices on decisions like 5G technology. So when we say decoupling, it's this notion that the United States and China should sever the complex supply chains that bind them together. Well, if the coronavirus has exposed anything, it's exposed the importance of the supply chains, of logistics and delivery. And we've seen a complete shutdown of things like mail delivery or packages in the early phases of the coronavirus. So you can imagine with some new technology platform in the area of e-commerce, if one side grabs a large market share in the logistics chain, but doesn't want to share that logistic chain with others, or if there's only one, if you have to pick one side or the other, you can see that quickly countries within the region, within Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia as well, will run into trouble. It's going to lead to huge financial losses. And the link that this has, that trade and technology has to security, is that for the longest time, this idea of complex interdependence, that US and Chinese economies were linked together, had helped cushion the blow, or at least mitigate the possibility of strategic competition or outright conflict. But now you see these off-ramps and these breaks which can help slow down competition being thrown out the door. And if these are thrown out the window, Beijing, Washington, and other countries may show and exercise less strength. So this is where the pandemic has really affected one key sector, trade and technology, but it has important ramifications for the strategic relations. Now, I'm just going to close by just talking about some of the challenges and even hopefully some opportunities that countries can face, especially here within the Southeast Asia region. And so, what can ASEAN as a regional bloc do? So I want to mention that the coronavirus has affected Southeast Asian countries in really different ways. I was just looking at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS in Washington, D.C. They have a COVID-19 pandemic tracker for Southeast Asia. And it really shows that the 10 ASEAN countries are all over the place when it comes to how they've dealt with the coronavirus in terms of the number of cases, the number of deaths. But it's a reflection of the different political systems, the different levels of economic development, the geographic size, and the demographics of each country. It's not really fair to compare Brunei's success to Indonesia and Philippines' relative failure in dealing with the coronavirus. But despite all these differences, there really can be can there be something learned? Is there a way to pool knowledge and resources? And right now, organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, and some are saying have become politicized. That's why the United States has pulled out or stopped contributing. At the global level, we've seen real problems in trying to coordinate a collective action in responding to the pandemic. But what about within the region? And so there can be many lessons learned given the different size and shaped demographics of Southeast Asian countries. And so I know perhaps Professor Anthony Calabera may be able to speak on this further, but what sorts of cooperation, what sorts of opportunities exist for pandemic cooperation within ASEAN countries? And then the second area, of course, is coming to the troubled South China Sea. Unfortunately, we've seen the South China Sea, the risk of conflict escalating, not de-escalating during the pandemic. We've seen clashes between Vietnam and Philippine fishing vessels with the Chinese Coast Guard. The US has firmed up, it's firmly made its position clear about the UN ruling in favor of the Philippines rejecting Chinese claims in the South China Sea. And recently officials, ASEAN officials and Chinese officials met in Indonesia, and they did at least agree that some kind of code of conduct needs to be established. But right now the action and rhetoric are not really matching. But clearly, because of the risks, the escalation of violence, the probable escalation of violence that we might see, it just highlights this idea that we have to come up with a diplomatic rather than a military solution. And so that might be another area that ASEAN can maybe try to coordinate some kind of consensus before they reach out to China and other countries. And lastly, there's always opportunities during a crisis, and we've been hearing about the United States and China both providing funds, support for Southeast Asian countries to address the pandemic. And it's not to say that countries like the Philippines or Malaysia or Indonesia should be playing off China and the United States, but again, it's not a zero-sum solution. And so, to that extent, I think ASEAN may be in a good position to try to court China and the United States. There's always this fear that you don't want to anger the other, but right now it seems like there is a willingness it's maybe the one positive that I might say in my remarks, but that we are seeing a willingness between China and the United States in providing aid to regional actors. And so if there's a way for Southeast Asian countries to coordinate some kind of mechanism in terms of how aid is received and how it's dispersed, how it's used, that might be at least a small area for cooperation. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. May I now invite Dr. Abdul Abiad to give his presentation. Abdul, please.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to join you. When I first got this invitation, I thought maybe it had been misdirected because I'm an economist, and the focus on strategic issues. I had told Professor Kraft, it's not my expertise. I can't speak on that, but when he told me the context, and it's true that basically, the economy and how it proceeds very much shapes, power and strategic issues. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you about this morning. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. I hope you guys can see it. But what I'll be sharing with you today is basically the outlook for developing Asia. And this is based on the Asian Development Bank's Asian Development Outlook Report, which we put out twice a year, first in April, and then an update in September. So this one came out on September 15, and it's what I'll be basing my presentation on. You can find it on the ADB website. And apart, just for a bit more background information, apart from talking about regional outlook and risks, the outlook also contains a thematic chapter on a development issue. So in April, it was on what drives innovation in Asia. This particular issue that came out in September looks at wellness in Asia. This was something we started working on even before COVID, turned out to be very timely. But so the idea being that wellness is a growing sector, given that the region is more middle income, but obviously with COVID as well, it may be a sector that will drive the recovery going forward. So let me begin by giving you the key messages of the report. The first is that developing Asia, which again includes, for ADB, we define this as 46 developing Asian economies, ranging from those in Central and West Asia to South Asia, to East Asia, Southeast Asia, and even those in the Pacific. So developing Asia as a group will contract by 0.7% this year, and it will be the first contraction in 6 decades. The last time we saw the region contract was in the early 1960s when China went through a very severe agricultural famine. We expect growth to rebound to close to 7% next year, but as we emphasize in this report, this is not a V-shaped recovery despite the growth rates. If you look at levels, this growth rate means it will still leave us below where we would have been in 2021 without COVID. Second important message is that the downturn is broad-based. So, you know, I mentioned the last contraction in the early 1960s. That was mainly because China contracted by a lot, but most of the other economies in the region were growing. This time around, 3/4 of the region's economies are expected to experience negative growth. And interestingly, China is one important exception. It's expected to post positive growth this year, and I'll talk about that in a bit, and why you're seeing these differences within the region. Third, in terms of the risks to the outlook, the most important one really is the possibility of a prolonged pandemic and how that can basically derail the recovery. Other risks we highlight in the report are geopolitical tensions, especially the US-China tensions over trade and technology that Professor Yao had mentioned. And also, I'll mention this in my last slide, you know, unclear long-term socioeconomic impacts. And there are many facets there. It can affect everything from potential growth to inequality to trade as well. So many different ways that COVID might change how the region will be, with obviously many implications, including in terms of strategic issues. So just very briefly on policies, the focus early on had been protecting lives. I think the realization now is that you need to protect both lives and livelihoods, and that there's actually no trade-off between the two. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail later. And there obviously has to be a focus on the most vulnerable, poor households, small and medium-sized enterprises. And again, in the context of ensuring, protecting livelihoods, ensuring a safe return to work and a restart of business activities. Basically learning to live with COVID-19, since it's now clear that this is not going away anytime soon. So let me just go through a few quick slides. One, because the pandemic is changing basically week to week, I just wanted to give everybody a snapshot of where we are now. The left chart shows you how the pandemic has evolved across the globe. And basically what we see is that currently developing Asia is actually where you are seeing the most new cases, roughly about 100,000 new cases daily. Please note that on both charts, these are log scales. So as you go from one horizontal grid line to the next, it's an increase by a factor of 10. So developing Asia, about 100,000 new daily cases. Latin America, which had previously been highest, has come down a bit or stabilized, and they're now at about 60,000 daily new cases. The US saw a first wave in March, April, a second wave in July, and it came down. It's sort of on the rise again. They're at about 40,000 new cases a day. In Euro area, also sort of had a first wave, and then you've seen it increasing again, and they're currently having about 20,000 new cases a day. If we zoom in to the developing Asia region, and that's the chart on the right, you can see that it's really primarily concentrated in South Asia, which accounts for about 90,000 new daily cases out of that 100,000. Southeast Asia has about 8,000 new cases a day. Central Asia about 2,000. East Asia, despite China, very populous China being there, has only about 100 new cases a day, and the Pacific has 1. In fact, it's been hovering. Most Pacific Island economies have managed to avoid having a significant outbreak. So this is important because it really sets the stage. It really puts context on how the economy has evolved. What's happened is that because of the outbreak, as you know, many economies have had to impose containment measures of varying stringency, and this has restricted mobility and domestic activity. So the chart on the left is based on Oxford University's stringency index. It measures things like workplace and school closures, stay-at-home policies, travel restrictions. So it's nine indicators, and you can construct a composite that goes from 0 to 100. And in this chart, we show the evolution from January to end September, with darker shades indicating more stringent containment. So the first thing you notice is that many countries started imposing containment measures in March and April, and they were pretty drastic. They were very dark. They were particularly dark in South Asia, in the middle, and in many Central Asian countries at the top. Southeast Asia is sort of a mix. You have countries like the Philippines where it was very severe. Then you have East Asia where on average you had less stringent measures, and the Pacific where, again, because they had didn't have an outbreak, also less severe. What's happened since then is, so those were held in place by a month or 2 months, and then countries realized this was unsustainable and started easing policies. And so you see that in many cases, things have gotten, the shades have become lighter. Nevertheless, what's happened is that, with those stringent containment measures, what you had was a reduction in mobility. We have a chart in the report, I don't show it here, showing the very strong correlation between stringency and mobility outside the home as measured by Google mobility reports. And this chart on the right basically shows what happens, shows the relationship between mobility outside the home and domestic economic activity, well, actually in this case, as measured by GDP. And so you can see that, the lower, the larger the reduction in average mobility, so the more to the left you are, the bigger the GDP growth decline in the first and second quarters relative to GDP growth in the fourth quarter. So for the Philippines in particular, you can see that it's that red dot in the lower left corner. Mobility was about 60% below normal, and as a result, our GDP was, as you know, the outcome in the second quarter was a 16% contraction compared to our pre-COVID growth of about 6-7%. And so domestic economic activity took a big hit because of this, but also because the pandemic was global, you had a hit to global economic activity and to global trade. And so this is what we see in this chart: real exports on the left and real imports on the right. And what you can see is the dashed lines shows global imports and exports. The brown line is the G3, developed economies, and then the green line is developing Asia. So you see sort of this sharp contraction in all across all three lines, and then that we're already on the rebound now. So it was a sharp contraction because of that, all the travel restrictions, the collapse in economic activity, but we've seen that bottom out, and we're now already in the recovery. What's interesting also is that Asia's trade fell by less than global trade, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the downturn for the region as a whole was not as sharp, and therefore imports fell by less. Exports we've seen an interesting story. What's happened is that for certain countries in certain sectors, exports have been strong. In particular, exports of health supplies by China and other East Asian and Southeast Asian countries has been strong. So they were able to step in to fill the surging demand for health equipment and health supplies. Similarly, there's been an uptick in demand for electronics, and that as well is sort of one of Asia's strengths, and so that's helped support exports in this period. So if you combine that decline in domestic activity and this hit on trade, what you have is basically a slump in growth in the first half of this year. And you can see that in the yellow dots. So what this this chart shows us 11 major economies in developing Asia, starting with PRC and India on the left, the 5 ASEAN countries in the middle, and the newly industrialized economies on the right. And basically, the yellow dots show you the growth in 2019 and the growth in the first half of this year. And you can see that for all countries, bar none, there's been a decline in GDP growth. And the bars basically show you the contributions on the demand side to that decline in growth. And what you can see is that the orange part, which is the contribution of consumption, basically declined. And this is one thing we haven't seen in a long time. Even through the trade conflict, domestic demand had been supporting growth in the region, but it did not survive this pandemic. Really took a hit because people were not able to go out. And so you see contractions in consumption in many economies. You also see a hit to investment in several economies, particularly in India and the Philippines. And so really it's sort of a double whammy, external and domestic, leading to this sharp contraction in economic activity in the first half. We're now seeing a recovery, so things are slowly recovering because containment measures are being eased and because activity is starting to normalize across many economies. Because of that sharp decline in economic activity, though, it's true that Asian governments stepped in with a wide-ranging crisis response. And so this comes from ADB's COVID-19 policy database, where my colleague Jesus Felipe basically and his team keep track of the various policy measures put in place on the economic side to respond. So this includes things like government support to income and revenue, which are the blue bars, things like transfers to households or support to small and medium-sized enterprises, which account for about half of total support in the region. The rest of the support is basically in the form of ensuring that credit continues to flow and that liquidity doesn't dry up. And you can see how it varies across the subregions of Asia there. We also put in the advanced economies as a comparator, much larger support packages in the advanced economies, in part because they have the mechanisms to put those things into place quickly. Now, even with this substantial support, again, that has not stopped the contraction. So our forecast, as I said, is for a contraction of about 0.7% this year, and that's revised down from our forecast of 2.2% in April and 0.1% in June. And the chart on the right basically shows, if you translate those growth rates into output levels, you can see the path in solid red on the right. And basically it shows that we don't go back to the pre-COVID trend by next year. It's only a slow recovery. You might call this an L-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped recovery. And here's some detail on the forecasts. I've highlighted a few countries there. Well, so first thing is to notice that the downgrade in forecasts for all countries. You see those red arrows for 2020. So yeah, so you see, and as I said, many countries are expected to have negative growth this year. A few exceptions include China. Taipei China is what ADB calls it, is also expected to post still positive growth this year, though very low, obviously. Vietnam would be one country in Southeast Asia expected to post positive growth. Many others are expected to see negative growth. One of the countries to see both the largest revision to growth and the largest largest contraction this year is India, which we expect to contract by 9% for this fiscal year. So again, for Southeast Asia, it's interesting to contrast the Philippines and possibly Thailand on the one hand, where large contractions are expected, and Vietnam on the other. So I'll link this up to what I said earlier. Both China and Vietnam managed to contain their outbreaks early and normalize economic activity and therefore post positive growth. And so really it's there's really not a trade-off, not in the short run, not in the long run as well, because you can't have full recovery without getting the outbreak under control. I think the trade-off only emerges when you use blunt instruments like large-scale lockdowns. if that's the only thing you use, then yes, you know, it can flatten the curve, the health curve, but it kills the economic curve. So those two countries used many other techniques. Again, it's not new. We know it's testing, tracing, ensuring adequate health system capacity and treatment. So here's my last slide. I just wanted to talk about the risks to that. You know, so it's already a pretty negative forecast, but despite that, the risks are still primarily to the downside. And as I said, the main risk is one of a prolonged pandemic, either an extended first wave, as we are seeing in the Philippines or India, or recurrent waves, as we've seen in several other countries, which obviously can stifle recovery by affecting both demand and supply. There's also the potential that a prolonged pandemic could trigger crisis in some economies. So take India, for example, which already had financial vulnerabilities. If the economy is hit hard, you may see financial fragilities worsening over there. Our report quantifies exactly what what size impact a prolonged pandemic might have, and I won't go into that, but just to refer you if there's interest in that. Geopolitical tensions, and again, most notably the US-China frictions over trade and technology. There's something we've been discussing for over 2 years now, since January 2018, and actually even before that. Again, the two biggest losers are the US and China, the two main protagonists. China stands to lose basically at least 1% of GDP in lost output because of the trade conflict, even as it currently stands. For the rest of the region, it's actually an offset of two factors. On the one hand, they get hit because they supply intermediate goods to China. On the other, some economies have actually gained, including Vietnam in Southeast Asia and Bangladesh in South Asia, as a result of trade and production redirection. So buyers not buying from China because of higher tariffs, but then buying instead from alternative suppliers in Vietnam and Bangladesh and elsewhere. And obviously, if this lasts longer, you may have a shift in production out of China into other countries in the region. There's one upside risk, which is early vaccine arrival, but really this is tempered by, even if this does happen, there's a question of how quickly production can be ramped up, and the fact that developing economies are likely last in the queue. And so you're already seeing advanced economies buying up vaccine supplies in bulk at the beginning. And lastly, let me end on the point about the long-term effects of the pandemic. So one is that growth potential in developing Asia can take a hit. We know there will be a hit to human capital, both on the health side, but also in terms of education. You have long-term school closures or distance learning in countries where it is much less effective, and I'll talk about that in the next point. There are hits to fiscal capital, especially if this gets prolonged. You'll have businesses going out of business. Sorry, also on the human capital side, the longer you have people unemployed, they just drop out of the workforce. Income inequality can get hit both through unemployment, but also through the digital divide. Those who have access to technology will do better during this crisis. And also we know that it's the poor who are taking the biggest hit right now. Lastly, in terms of trade, there's a big question about, are we in for more deglobalization or just stagnant trade moving forward? And I'm happy to discuss that during the Q&A. So let me end here. I think many interesting implications for strategic issues and foreign policy from this economic outlook. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Abdul. That was quite an interesting take on the economic aspect of the pandemic. Now let's go on to Professor Meli Anthony Caballero. Meli, please.
Thank you, Julio. Let me also start first by thanking the organizers, CIDS and Konrad, for, I think, a very, the strategic environment that we face. Let me, the two our two panelists have already quite sort of discuss, so have from the politics and security side may not fully understand. But with that, so let me just sort of calibrate my presentation by looking at the changes or the issues about security in the region, particularly from the perspective of Southeast Asia, and the extent to which COVID-19 has really sort of raised tensions perhaps, or made many of these challenges more acute. Three observations I think are also necessary just to put a context to where we are. You know, in security studies, we always talk about, you know, black swans, low probability, high impact. And I can't recall, you know, a black swan that happened in recent history that has had such an extraordinary, devastating impact globally. The last one I could think about is 9/11, which, you know, had really, you know, which had significant changes as far as, you know, busting the notion of US invisibility as a superpower when they get attacked in their own territory. It led to a long, prolonged war that actually sowed divisions in regions around the world and even within societies, and to a certain extent affected our daily life. Think about, for example, the kind of security checks that have since been adopted after 9/11. But the second observation is the disruption that the current one that we actually face, this extraordinary once-in-a-century pandemic, is really very massive and quite long-lasting. I was telling Herman earlier on that I had this bet with my colleagues here in Singapore that, you know, looking at the experience from SARS or H1N1, SARS in 2003 and H1N1 in 2009, maybe we're looking at maybe about 6 months at the most, but how it is now unfolding, we can't yet see the end of the tunnel as far as this COVID-19 is concerned. And the costs and the challenges are really still being counted. I note that, you know, even down to economic projection, it keeps being updated in light of really the kind of challenges. And, you know, when you project something and then something comes up, you know, you have to tweak again the way you calculate it. And more especially also is that science and research, as far as this current pandemic is concerned, has had to play catch up. And I think until now, we still don't have really a full grasp about the extent to which this disease is unfolding. And, you know, the treatment is still being also refined. And because of that, you know, the uncertainty has in fact even become more acute. So the third observation is that with this pandemic, you know, it's coming at a time where the international environment, strategic environment, is also very much challenged, especially in our part of the world. This changes really the way we look at the nature of security and our assumptions about security. And this is really where I want to sort of take off. With you know, having this kind of crisis happening in once in a century, the kind of disruption and the kind of changes, what does it mean, therefore, for our Asian security? I offer 4 points, which actually looks at the assumptions and what it means. The first is US, the role of the US as a guarantor of Asian security. Second is the expectations of, you know, having a sustained economic growth in Asia, which has really been the driver also, or one of the primary foundations of peace and security. Third is the role of China, whether it is a peaceful, revisionist global power. And fourth is really the centrality of ASEAN in the Asia's multilateral institutional landscape. So let me start with the US. Dr. Yo has talked about you know, US actually using the pandemic as a means to further challenge the China. But from our perspective, I mean, what does it mean actually for the U.S. in light of the challenges that it faces? Do we continue to look at the U.S. as that provider of Asian security? It's been a resident power. We have relied on it as, you know, we have benefited from it, not just in security terms, but also in economic terms. The U.S. has actually allowed the region to sort of prosper because of that security umbrella that is supposed to provide. But we are also at the cusp of what could really be a significant power transition in the region. And the transition has been around for some time, but it's getting perhaps more clear as now we see China really displaying you know, the kind of both material and military power and even diplomatic power, not just confined to Asia, but to the other regions in the world. So how the US, its role and the transition that's happening, how we are going to navigate this in terms of you know, assuring that the region remains secure is really very important. And more significantly, how the US actually responds to a more confident and a more powerful China. This is a test of its ability. We ask ourselves whether it's a test of its ability to hold on to that, you know, hegemonic power, more so now in COVID-19. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, you know, avoiding what is been seen as a Thucydides trap, where the hegemon, you know, fears of a rising power actually triggers competition and hopefully, you know, not leading to confrontation or even war. Now, could this, in fact, as a result of COVID, could this be a tipping point to more open confrontation? You know, especially in a time when the relationship between these two major powers are very, very fractious. So that is a question on US leadership. But there's the other form of leadership and its ability to provide security that has come to the fore and that has been exposed. You know, one of the compelling things about US power, if you like, is because it is also able to provide, you know, the global public goods. But COVID-19 has really tested US leadership, or because it's not really been leading, it is in the critical juncture where the whole world is faced with this existential threat. The US leadership has been very absent. And if you can see in the way it has actually dealt with the pandemic in its own territory, its response to battling this has been appalling and very dismal, to say the least. This is in large contrast to the US leadership it has displayed even during up to the time of the Ebola crisis. I mean, in 2014, the US was leading this movement towards a global health security, which, you know, started with a membership of 67 countries that really enabled or pushed countries to be prepared for pandemic outbreaks in three areas. It is in detecting, it is in mitigating and containing and responding to a possible pandemic. This is after its experiences with SARS and H1N1. Now, note that you know, in our part of the world, this has not really been the first time we had a pandemic. So that leadership that US provided in 2014 was really, really quite significant. And unfortunately, this is really missing. The second assumption that we've had is the kind of economic progress and stability that has for the longest time really served as a strong foundation for peace and security in the region. As Dr. Abiad has already discussed, the pandemic has really hit us hard and very, very hard. You know, economic forecast as a result of what has happened when economies locked down, borders have closed, business travels have halted, tourism and other industries have almost become decimated. You know, you have planes now flying empty just to be able to upkeep their maintenance. So there are some who look at the crisis really as the worst recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And what we then foresee is, you know, for a region that has been a darling of foreign investments for the last 15 to 20 years, what does it mean, therefore, for, you know, the ability of the region to press ahead if the outlook, economic outlook, is really very, very dire? You know, was it in Southeast Asia alone, we're looking at contraction of between 1 to 7 or 8%. Here in Singapore, the contraction has really been quite frightening. They're looking at 4 to 7% for this year alone, and this is the first contraction of that kind of nature since the 1960s. It compels us to ask about what a prolonged economic crisis mean for stability in the region. I recall very vividly, as a result of Asian financial crisis in 1997, it actually led to instability, and in some, you know, it also led to the downfall of the Suharto regime that has been there for the last 30 years. If human insecurity reaches a point where the ability of the government to respond to a long and prolonged crisis, right, that will have a lot of ramifications on people's health and on people's relations, its relations with the state, etc. Could that perhaps be a basis for looking out for possible internal conflicts, particularly in countries where there is already a history of internal conflict? So what you are therefore, we should be mindful about is the extent to which this could be a further driver to and could exacerbate existing societal conflict triggered by this prolonged economic uncertainty. Third is something that we've already talked about, but I think is worth mentioning again, is really what this current situation, what this brings us insofar as responding to a more assertive China. China's new assertiveness, is from its what we call warrior worth diplomacy, really is in stark contrast to its talk about growing together as a region, and this has actually led to a trust deficit now between China and countries in Southeast Asia. Now, unlike the US, China is a reality in our doorstep. And they're very mindful that on the one hand, we need to have to cultivate good relations with China and of course the United States. But COVID-19, as a result of what's happening, has actually revealed a widening power asymmetry between China and Southeast Asia. Now, when you look at what happened in 2003, I mean, just for comparison, when SARS broke out in 2003, in terms of economic power alone, China actually only accounted for 4% of global GDP. Fast forward to now, 17 years later, it now makes up about close to 20%. And given that we, together with China, are integral to the global supply chain, and 20% of that is also coming from China, what's happening is that it is accentuating the growing influence of this major power. And China has also showed that it has more latitude to become more assertive militarily and diplomatically. Think about what's happening in the South China Sea from March and April of this year. We can talk about that later. But I think what is relevant at this point is, in last year, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies actually published a report looking at perceptions of ASEAN countries towards major powers. And according to that survey, China, compared to the rest of ASEAN's dialogue partners, is actually the least trusted of ASEAN's partners despite the fact that it has very strong economic ties with the region. And it has also shown its ability to provide public goods through its Belt and Road Initiative. And this is also part of this declaration of grow with us geoeconomic strategy. But during this extraordinary period of a crisis, as I said, it has not stopped China from being adventurous in the South China Sea, right? So in a way, China has failed to do the right thing, perhaps, and act as a responsible stakeholder in Asia, one that respects international laws and codes of conduct. So President Xi's wish to position China as as China's rights as beneficial to others, and its statements of a common destiny are very much disconnected from its inability to exercise restraint. And the fourth point is COVID-19 is really now a huge challenge to Asia's biggest assets in its security. And I refer to the institutions that it has developed over the years, particularly ASEAN and the ASEAN-led frameworks like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN +3, and the EES, as well as the economic frameworks like the Economic Community and soon to be signed RCEP. Now, we would all agree that despite the limitations of these institutions, they have served as very important pillars of regional security, stability, and prosperity. But COVID-19 has exacerbated the pressures on these institutions. How? I mean, if you look at now the tensions between US and China, ASEAN, the East Asia Summit, we have largely become bystanders to the sharpening of tensions between these two powers. I mean, since COVID-19, there's been a lot of concern expressed not only by analysts, but even political leaders about the escalating conflict of these two countries. In the July and August edition of Foreign Affairs, the Singapore Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, actually talked about the endangered Asian century, really raising concerns about the US confrontation. And it shows also the inability perhaps of these regional institutions to manage this conflict in a more comforting way. Even the former Australian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd, the Cold War, he calls it Cold War 1.5. So in relation to our institutions, it really compels us to ask whether the ASEAN narrative is still relevant, or is it still compelling? Are we really doing enough to respond to this kind of challenges, particularly this pandemic? We ask ourselves, where is ASEAN centrality in all of this? We can, of course, look at the way ASEAN has responded. Dr. Yeo asked me to say a few things, but two things are perhaps worth noting. As I said, in spite of the limitations that we face, we only have to maximize what we have in the region. And in terms of ASEAN initiatives in dealing with the pandemic, although much of the pandemic control is really a national rather than a more regional responsibility, there's been quite significant exchange and cooperation among the ASEAN health ministers. In fact, early on, at the outbreak of the crisis in early January to mid-February, they were able to activate many of the mechanisms for information sharing, particularly when it comes to understanding the nature of the crisis, of this pandemic and the spread, and all the other protocols that need to be followed for pandemic preparedness and response. A few months later, they are now looking at, ensuring that the region could probably help in having a stockpile of therapeutics, and of course, ideally it will be the vaccines, but vaccines are yet to come on stream, of therapeutics that can actually be mobilized to help countries, particularly those countries that may not have enough access to these therapeutics. This happened in 2009. And because of that history of having a stockpile of medicine, there's a lot of discussion now, and I think there's a movement to ensure that this stockpile can actually be developed further. And I think more importantly, there is now the push to actually have an ASEAN version of its Centers for Disease Control, a regional center for disease control, because there's the view that this is not the last pandemic that we're going to see. I mean, in light of a fast changing physical environment, and of course also with the looming threat of climate change, the region really needs to be more prepared. Now, economically, there's been talk about a developmental fund, but it's more symbolic more than anything, because if you look at the extent of the economic needs of many countries in the region, the amount that's been bandied around is not really very clear. It's nothing like what you see in the EU as far as the economic fund is concerned. I mean, the EU, you're talking about essentially 350 billion euros, or approximately $2 trillion US. I mean, ASEAN doesn't have that kind of capacity, but there are other things that can actually be done, and it's being talked about. And one of that is really ensuring that the trade lines are open and that there's a smooth flow of essential goods, and refrain from imposing unnecessary tariff, particularly when it comes to essential goods, and even down to food supplies. So supply chain connectivity and supply chain resilience is something that's been discussed very often now among our trade ministers, and also looking at ways where you are able to mobilize certain mechanisms. For example, the ASEAN +3 rice emergency mechanism, should there be instances of sudden food shortages in member states in ASEAN. So, but having said this, all of these things, from the role of the UN as a traditional security provider, the ability of the region to regain that kind of economic prosperity, the role of China and its implications, all of this three on how we move as a region and our institutions have really come to fore, and requires us to think deeply as to how we can move forward as as we deal with the fast changing, with the fast changes that is happening, and of course with this pandemic upon us. So I think I will stop here, and we can continue with this in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melly, and I'd like to thank the panelists for the broad and deep overview of the developments in the region. So I don't want to summarize that yet, but I'd like to go to the questions now. Just a broad question. Do you think that the U.S. elections will have an impact on pandemic recovery, as well as possible tensions in the region? And specific questions for each one. For Dr. Caballero, ASEAN centrality has been represented as a way of ensuring cooperative arrangements to reduce the extent of great power competition. To what extent does it still have any role to play in the regional strategic situation? And for Abdul, which sectors of the economy are likely to recover the fastest once the COVID-19 pandemic is over? I assume this is talking about the Philippines, but if you can also provide a regional overview, that would be great. And for Andrew, do you think that the US PRC decoupling will continue? And if so, what would be ASEAN's role in this in terms of cushioning the impact without affecting the recovery from the pandemic? So I'd like to start with Abdul. Would you go, please?
Sure, happy to take that question. So let me actually share a slide because that might be the best way to answer that. We did analysis in June in terms of the economic impact of the pandemic, and these are the results that came up from that. I'll show you two slides. This one basically shows the impact on individual economies in developing Asia via the channels through which they'll be affected. So the way to read this is, let's take the Philippines, for example, where the impact was, at that time, this was in June, our estimate of the impact was about, 7-8% of GDP. Most of it, a small part was coming through global spillovers, basically weaker demand, excluding tourism. Another part of it in orange is the part coming from the tourism impact, international tourism demand decline. But you see that the bulk of it, in the case of the Philippines, was the domestic demand decline as a result of the stringent lockdowns. But you can see across, it really differs across economies. You have the tourism-dependent economies, mainly in the Pacific, and then Maldives in South Asia, but also, let's say, Cambodia and Thailand in Southeast Asia, where tourism is really the primary channel through which economies will be affected. Let me show you then what that means for specific sectors. So this is, if you translate that into which sectors of the economy get affected, well, the quick answer is that it's actually pretty broad-based. The decline in economic activity really has not spared any sector. But so if you look at it, because of the hits to tourism in many countries, you have the yellow indicates the contribution of declines in hotels, restaurants, and other personal services. Transport, which is green, takes a hit as well. But it's not just that. So you see orange, which is basically business, trade, personal, and public services. These are your, the services you get on a normal basis outside. These have taken a hit in the Philippines and elsewhere. So this is the orange bar, but even manufacturing is going to take a hit. The question was about which ones will bounce back quickly, right? So here, this tells you which sectors have been hardest hit. Our analysis suggests that tourism and tourism-related sectors will be very slow in recovering. One is that, the travel restrictions have been in place much longer than expected. And if you look at surveys of passengers, let's say by IATA, 55% of respondents basically said even after travel bans are lifted, they will wait 6 months to a year or more, or have put off travel plans indefinitely. So there's really no plan for traveling soon by a big chunk of potential travelers. So that's one that will be slow in recovering. What then will be the sectors that will be recovering fast? They'll be the ones that are not constrained, or that may actually even benefit from social distancing, right? So things like e-commerce, what else? Digital payments are something that are accelerating now. A lot of electronics, as I mentioned earlier, and obviously the health sector as well has the potential to grow. So those are sectors that will probably. So an easy question to ask yourself is, how, if we expect social distancing, we think the outbreak, that COVID-19 will be with us for a longer period. Social distancing will become a norm, at least for in the remainder of this year, and likely through a substantial chunk of 2021. Which sectors can survive and thrive under those circumstances? And they were the ones I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. And can I ask Andrew to go next?
Sure. I'll combine the question about ASEAN's role in cushioning US PRC decoupling, and also just macro level strategies to offer ASEAN. In terms of cushioning the blow, ASEAN as an organization, I'm not sure what they can do specifically, but in terms of individual ASEAN member states, as Dr. Caballero Anthony had mentioned, how there are these opportunities, because as companies move away from China, they may move into Southeast Asia, and then there's a lot of room for digital digital infrastructure, things like ASEAN has these smart cities, and that requires investment from different companies, whether they're Japanese companies, Korean companies, from U.S. companies, and so they may come to Southeast Asia. So individually, there's room for ASEAN member states to try to tap into these resources to seek development assistance, and also approach multilateral development banks like the ADB or the World Bank. And doing so, they can mitigate this competition between U.S. and China. This also means approaching China and seeking some kind of aid or loan through BRI or through the AIIB. So it's taking an approach where you don't pick just one country, but you try to diversify where you're receiving support from. And if there's a way for ASEAN, I'm not saying that ASEAN should oversee all of this, but there are ways where ASEAN member states come together and they can have ASEAN institutionally support or encourage that kind of development. That might be a way of mitigating the blow or the fallout that might come from decoupling. And if I may, I know this question wasn't directly asked of me, but in terms of what happens if Trump, I think Trump it seems like he's going to survive COVID, but in terms of the elections and potential change in government, I'm actually, my university is in Washington, D.C. I just voted in the U.S. elections a couple of weeks ago, so I've been thinking a lot about these implications. And for Asia, of course, if Trump continues, we've already seen really kind of the influence that's had in terms of U.S. leadership, of lack of trust in U.S. leadership. I think U.S. as a global leader, as a regional leader, there may be more distrust just because of the way he's treated certain allies, his disparaging remarks about institutions. And so I think we're going to see, in that sense, we're going to see, I think, China's influence continue to grow within the region, and the tensions continue. With a Biden, if Biden were to win, on one hand, it would certainly allay fears. There would be more, I think there would be a more disciplined U.S. foreign policy for the region, which is good for alliances, which is good for things like predictability. But the one caveat that I might make is, there's an assumption that things can improve, or there might be, we might move to a greater cooperation because Biden and the Democrats are more in favor of going through multilateral institutions, or they support alliances. But from China's vantage point, it could actually be more troubling, because if, as we know from Biden when he was vice president, and even when he was president when he was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was a hawk on China. He was pretty hard on China. I don't see those views changing. But if instead of going unilaterally, if Biden and his Democrat foreign policy team decide to reach out to allies, if they try to form a multilateral coalition, so to speak, in its approach to China, that could actually force China into a corner, into a hole. So in some ways, whether you have a Republican or a Democrat come to the White House, I see this tension between the U.S.-China continuing. But in terms of its relationship with other allies and partners within the region, I think at least they'll know where the U.S. stands on certain positions. So there's more predictability, and predictability, of course, can help enhance stability.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Melly, go ahead, please.
I think the question was on centrality, and okay, so why don't I sort of answer it this way? I think when you look at what ASEAN has done best, it's always been it's seen as an honest broker. It doesn't seem to be siding either or. And the kind of platforms that ASEAN has offered over the years through its ASEAN-led institutions, I think is something that should not be necessarily dismissed, because in light really of growing tensions, then you need as much opportunity and several pathways to allow for cool heads to actually prevail. And this is what ASEAN has done. I mean, in spite of, it's being hampered, whereas before, without COVID, you can have all these side meetings during EES or the ARF. You can have people really coming together and talking and having coffee elsewhere. It hasn't stopped us from doing that, but of course the level of engagement is not different. But the pandemic is not going to be with us for a long time. I mean, okay, we think about the effect that's going to be longer term, but at some point, whether this year or mid next year, it has to come down. And I think you already see movements in that once this second wave is over. And so that ability of ASEAN to still be a convener is there. It's not something that you can actually dismiss. And if, in fact, it's going to be a Biden administration come January, and the history of that administration, if you look back in 2011, when, once again, the US actually has actually sort of, quote unquote, realized the need to be present in the region. You see Obama coming in 2011 when they had the East Asia Summit, ensuring that the pivot to China is there. The question perhaps is that going to happen? Is Biden going to have a pivot to Asia 1.5? I think what is worrying to me, at least, is that maybe in light of really the current condition in the US, you hardly hear any policy on Asia, right? But, so that is a question that we ask ourselves. But the assumption is that if he follows what it was before, then, and he has always sort of underscored the need to work with others, you can make America great by working with others and not by isolating yourself, then that movement back to multilateralism and more interest in multilateralism will do us a lot of good, ASEAN and the US and the other parties in the region, to actually go back to that kind of some kind of pathways to a better relations in the region. And don't forget that there are other partners that ASEAN has been engaging with. I think ASEAN's relations with Japan and South Korea has been good. And lo and behold, you actually have the interest of the European Union. I mean, you talk about Germany's policy, in the Pacific, which to me is really very interesting. So what one could argue that despite the challenges that we face, right, there is still something in ASEAN-led institutions and the kind of dynamics that that some other parties, European and Germany in particular, has found interesting. So that is where, on one hand, at one level, you can see the centrality still being relevant. But to me, the centrality has to be its centrality among its member states, the centrality from within. And this is where, when I look at its responses to COVID-19, to a certain extent, one would say, well, not bad. It could be better. But at the end of the day, when it comes to pandemic containment, it's really the national policy, national governments that really has to take responsibility. But the kind of information sharing and capacity building that other member states through the ASEAN framework has done has really been quite impressive. I mean, if you talk to the health officials in the region, as I said, as early as January, by the way, just for information, when China, through the ASEAN +3 framework, actually conveyed to the ASEAN Secretariat Health Division that they actually have this outbreak. That was as early as January 10, right? ASEAN members were then alerted that they have to deploy their pandemic preparedness responses. So it was through that ASEAN +3 framework that has been built over the years, where enough information and there was enough alert that took place in the region. And since then, as I said, the kind of coordination, cooperation that's happening is in a way quite I won't say that impressive, but it is there. Now, to me, the greatest challenge is, in light of the fact that vaccines, everybody is so interested in vaccines, and there's this fear about vaccine nationalism because major countries already have their own bilateral arrangement with pharma. There's been discussion, and I've written in it, I've argued that this is really an opportunity now for ASEAN to be part of that, global supply chain of vaccine production, because we do have in ASEAN big pharmaceutical companies. Indonesia, for example, has a bilateral arrangements with Sinovac in China and another drug industry. There's no reason why Chinese, ASEAN countries cannot think about being part of that manufacturing hub of vaccines, right? Because, this is something that will perhaps a very visible demonstration that this ASEAN framework actually works. And I believe that is already being done. In fact, the Malaysian foreign minister has already talked about it. And there's been discussion. The extent to which that is going to be realized, to me, is something that's worth monitoring. But the other thing also about the ASEAN CDC, I mean, that is already in the works. They're talking about it, and if that's happening, and it is this kind of cooperation where you appreciate the relevance and the centrality of ASEAN for its member states. That doesn't mean, of course, that tensions are not happening, divisions are not happening. In case of the South China Sea, there's no reason, and I think Vietnam has argued that ASEAN should not be pushing ahead with the negotiations of the Code of Conduct, and for ASEAN to actually call out China, and there should be a single position in ASEAN in calling out China for its behavior in the South China Sea. But, all of these things have to be balanced in light of really the current needs and conditions in the region. So first things first. Thank you.
Thank you, Melly. I'd like to ask Andrew and Abdul. I mean, Melly has already given her take on ASEAN, but how do you assess ASEAN's response to the pandemic in terms of the way that they manage it, given the disparity in form and structure of the governments? And also for Abdul, will economic liberalization continue to be the dominant economic framework in the region? And finally, for Melly, thank you for mentioning the South China Sea. I think it leads us to greater questions of long-term peace and security, particularly in these difficult times where negotiations are done online. What should governments in the region, particularly ASEAN members, be doing more to advance security cooperation, given that they cannot meet, they cannot do their usual diplomacy, and basically doing things online? So, may I ask Andrew to take on that, to answer the questions first, followed by Abdul, and then.
If I understand, it was a question about how ASEAN has been managing COVID-19, and there is some other. If I'm looking at the Q&A box, they prefaced it in the context that democracy has taken a backseat in trying to address COVID. And the countries even outside the region have can go from taking strong arm tactics to militarizing. Taking a militarized response to COVID. So there've been a range of responses, and there is this concern about democracy. And so where does ASEAN fit in? On that angle, the responses have really come at the national level of national governments. I think that's the first, that's the starting point for most of these countries. And if within Southeast Asia, if one country decides to do a very stringent lockdown and use the military and the national police, the Philippines coming to mind, which I've experienced since March. There's not that much that I think ASEAN can do in the sense that they do adhere to this norm of non-interference. So they try. I don't think ASEAN, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think ASEAN has tried to weigh in and say, Philippines or Indonesia shouldn't be deploying the national police to address the coronavirus pandemic. But on the other hand, you can see what other countries, ASEAN countries, you can see what their neighboring countries have done. And so certainly in the Philippines, we understand that having a militarized response, maybe I don't know how much it could have helped reduce the number of COVID cases, but that can't be the answer given that the Philippines has the highest number of COVID cases in total and in per capita. And so in that sense, how can ASEAN respond? How can ASEAN see what's happening collectively and maybe respond that way? I also think Dr. Caballera Anthony's response about looking into things like a ASEAN CDC, that might be one way where ASEAN can try to address or provide information and advice to the countries in terms of managing COVID. But unfortunately, when it comes to policies like, should we have a strict lockdown versus should we allow for some easing to enable the economy to resume or to open up? I mean, those are things that are going to be decided at the national level. July, was there another question in there that I was supposed to address, or?
I think that's good ending. I'll move to Abdul first and then to Melly. Abdul?
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, so Professor Yeo answered that question on ASEAN's role very well, similar to how I would have answered it. If anything, yeah, it would be the role of information sharing, given, especially given that this pandemic's unprecedented. Governments were basically sort of figuring things out as they went along. So there may be scope for doing more of that information sharing on what has worked and what hasn't. I don't know to what extent that's been going on. We've been doing some of it at the ADB, where we invite policymakers from different countries, but ASEAN could play that role as well. So let me just take the question on what effect COVID-19 will have on whether economic liberalization will continue to be the dominant economic framework in the region. Let me just, again, share a screen. So I think the answer is yes, because basically Asia, probably more than any other region, has really benefited from global integration. You can see that here. I mean, really, Asia's trade expanded greatly in the first decade of 2000. Yes, you had the great trade collapse during the global financial crisis, but there was a quick recovery from that. And then even during the second decade of this century, when trade in many other areas was stagnating, you still continued to see expansion of trade in the region, not as quickly as in the first decade, but still a continued steady increase. In part, as you know, sort of global value chains, factory Asia. So that's really helped the region. And so I don't think Asia will be leaving that anytime soon. In fact, there's been a lot of worry in the region because ever since 2018, you've seen stagnant trade, first because of the trade conflict and then because of COVID-19. Here's a chart which basically just shows global growth and Asia's contribution to it in orange. And basically it just shows really how Asia has been driving global growth and has really benefited from, in large part because of that openness that we've experienced. Now, let me say though that it really, we're not talking here about unfettered economic liberalization. Asia from the beginning, if you look at the East Asian Miracle Report, it has always been sort of, openness, but with intervention when states felt it was appropriate. So even as a result of the Asian financial crisis, one of the things you saw was Malaysia putting in capital controls, and that becoming a recognition by not just governments, but even the IMF saying, there are times when you don't want unfettered capital flows. You do want to set restrictions on these things. Similarly, there's the role of government, let's say, in supporting innovation, which likely will become even more important if this technology war continues. And so it's yes, economic openness, let's call it that, has been important for Asia, and for that reason, they will support it and try to, whether it's through greater regional integration, to try to offset whatever protectionism you're seeing elsewhere. But it's not, again, it's not sort of complete economic liberalization. Just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Thank you. And Melly, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to take off from where Dr. Abdul has mentioned about the importance of trade and that really as a driver for growth. And this is where I think the discussion at the from the economic and trade ministers in ASEAN has really been concentrating on, and that in spite of the massive disruptions that that pandemic has caused, that you should really ensure that the supply chain is open and is resilient. And so in as far as the economic community is, and I think the regional economic comprehensive agreement partnership on trade, I think that is pushing through. So that is in the clearest indication that trade has to continue, and that all the conditions that promote for better trade, the reduction of non-tariff barriers or non-tariff measures, and in this time focusing on immediate goods and medical supplies, and that really has to remain unfettered. And that was actually, it became a very important agenda, because in the immediate period of the outbreak, there was actually some indication that the export controls were up as far as medical supplies were concerned. But then that whatever happens in my border actually affects you. And this is where, when you talk about in light of South China Sea, that being a looming threat, what else can actually be done to strengthen or to widen the cooperation? And let me just start again with what pandemic demands of the ASEAN countries. And because these are open economies, and trade and travel has to continue, and it cannot go on frozen forever. So there's actually an impetus now to finalize, I will use the word finalize, the travel and health protocol. So countries are actually looking at that, agreeing on common protocols, health protocols, for example, and it's starting on a bilateral basis, but the discussion is done at the regional basis, so that you can really allow for some kind of travel to continue just beyond the immediate business to business travel, but allow for tourism. So it's happening now with I think Singapore is starting with Malaysia, hopefully to widen it. But you need these protocols, and this is where regional cooperation really matters, because you need to ensure that other member states are actually, their standards are up to the mark, and they're stepping up in ensuring that you allow for regional travel, and of course beyond the region to resume, right? So travel and trade and health protocols are now being done. And look, when you look at security, I mean, the South China Sea negotiation will continue for some time, and it's talking about it's going to happen now, but the best that anyone can really hope for is to manage the tensions in the South China Sea. The resolution of the territorial disputes will go on forever. But what you don't want, really, is for China to continue with what it's doing now, right? I mean, under the cover of the pandemic, it's going there, it's establishing administrative regions, and it's being aggressive. ASEAN should really call out China. I said, and I couldn't, you have to come up with it. And I think it's starting to, because even the Philippine administration is not trying to call out China for what it's worth. I mean, Duterte's speech in the UN, is quite important if you take his statements quite seriously. So there is that, because it cannot continue, right? And I think this is something that on one level you do that, but on the other level you really then look at how you can best help or increase cooperation. There's so much talk about digital technology, and this is where, when you're looking at the wisdom of having this digital economy and connectivity as part of ASEAN's blueprint, but the challenge there is to ensure that the infrastructure is there, right? So is there, how much, I would like to see how much infrastructure is actually, in addition from the ADB that has been underwriting the cost of this, and in addition from China or Japan and South Korea within ASEAN countries, how are you helping with the digital technology to advance the digitalization? And digitalization has a lot of challenges, right? Upping up capacity building as far as resources are concerned. And this is where certain countries that are advanced in digital technology, like Singapore, to a certain extent, Malaysia, can actually help, right, countries. And so investments in fiber optics, for example, all of that needs to be discussed, and this is where you can widen the cooperation. Now, on other issues, other areas where security also is important. Now, the non-hard security, for example, things like food security, looking at issues of water security in the Mekong. I mean, there has to be more cooperation at that level. And it's important to examine the extent to which real cooperation is taking place in terms of materializing some of these, these declarations that they have, that the ASEAN comes up every summit or every meeting. And that is where I've been following health, so I can say that there is some, that cooperation is visible and it is significant. And looking at the food, now that it's going to be challenged in light of climate change, in terms of expanding digital technology in food production, and in terms of looking at filling in the gaps should there be a sudden acute shortage of food commodities. I think the discussion at that level, if you look at it to the sectoral parts, ASEAN is made up of many parts, right? So if you look at what some parts or some segments are doing, well, this is where you can appreciate what a regional organization can actually do. Right? But at the end of the day, when it comes to looking at controls, implementation, I mean, we all know that, it's really, subsidiarity matters. And this is where the national level and this national capacity to implement really becomes critical.
Thank you. And last round of questions, and I'd also like the panel to give their final thoughts on our topic today. Andrew, what has been the impact of COVID on the security architecture? The Quad has been active, the EAS is going to meet. What's your prognosis and your final thoughts as well? Abdul, questions about health versus economy. Is there really a trade-off? Are we really competing two critical aspects of our lives? And also your final thoughts. And Melly, how can ASEAN promote vaccine regionalism or prevent monopolies by major powers on this, or use vaccines as a tool again for great power diplomacy, as well as your final thoughts? Andrew, please.
Sure, thanks for asking that question about the regional institutional architecture, which I have a whole book on, of course, as you know. But in terms of pandemic and how that relates to the architecture, I mean, there isn't a direct, I don't think there's a direct impact, because institutions and organizations are a means to an end. I mean, the one impact they have is, someone had raised this question, but you have diplomats that are no longer able to meet face-to-face, or the opportunities for personal interaction have reduced. And of course, that's not good when you're trying to resolve really complex problems and issues. And we've already seen meetings either canceled or being conducted online, which I've talked to a couple of diplomats, and they say that it works okay, but it's not like sustainable in the long run. But in terms of the architecture, when there is intense rivalry and when there is tensions, and you need to share information, where you need more transparency, that is where the architecture can come into play. And there's a fear that the growth of regional institutions is just a reflection of a balance of power, that we see China having its preferred institutions, we see ASEAN promoting its institutions, the US wants to push the Quad and its alliances. And so some say that that's actually contributing to tensions. But as I've argued in my book, and actually a recent piece that came out in Global Asia, for me, I think the best outcome of all this tension and of China's rise is what I've referred to as a modified liberal order. So it's meaning that you still give credence to institutions and alliances, that they help underpin stability, but you have to have room for more. There has to be room for other players, for other countries, for developing countries, for China. And that's where I think the regional architecture needs to expand. It could be done through overlapping institutions, which we're seeing, but it just means we need to have more room for other players. And so in that sense, I think the regional architecture will continue to play an important role in a post-COVID environment.
Abdul, please.
Sure. So on the question of, again, this trade-off between the health and the economy, my answer is there isn't necessarily a trade-off, and there actually isn't a trade-off in the short or the long run. There are many policies you can use to address the health crisis. Many of them are good for both health and the economy. And it's only when you, again, when you're using the wrong tools, basically, such as large-scale lockdowns, that you have this trade-off. And unfortunately, you have economies which have not been able to deliver on the first best policies and resort to these, I wouldn't even call them second best because they're not good at all. Whether it's India in South Asia or the Philippines here in Southeast Asia, that's when you get the trade-offs. And so it's really a matter of, you know, finding the policies that we know work, that we've seen work in other countries. Final thoughts on, you know, just emerging trends. I guess what I hope came out of this discussion was there are going to be many changes to the region's economies, both within economies, things like, you know, increased digitalization, but also, you know, as a result and as of that and other factors, we're likely to see increased inequality. There's always a possibility of social unrest, and these can factor into, you know, political dynamics. Professor Caballero had mentioned the Asian financial crisis. Let's see what happens here. But then also at a regional level, what you're seeing is that, you know, we expect countries to bounce back, but they're bouncing back at different speeds. China is actually not going to shrink. And so this, you know, the rise of China, even though China has slowed, it is not contracting, whereas everybody else is. And so that will, I think, also have implications for, you know, political dynamics in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Melly, please.
Yeah, I think I answered this notion of vaccine regionalism earlier on, but just to sort of maybe repeat that, I think there is a good opening for the region, countries in the region, to be part of this, you know, whole scheme of vaccine manufacturing and the distribution of it. I mean, we do have the WHO co-led with CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, together with the Gates Foundation. They have the COVAX facility, and member countries like Singapore, and they're friends of the COVAX, and you know, Philippines is also part of it. Well, what you can do is, you know, complementary to the global international mechanism to ensure that vaccines are distributed fairly, right? That you're able to do that also to a certain extent at the regional level. Hence, the idea of coming up two levels. One is coming up with a stockpile, you know, a stockpile of not just vaccines, but also other drugs and therapeutics, for example, right? That is already in the works. So that is part of some kind of a regional, health regionalism, if you like. In vaccines, I don't know whether it is possible, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's also some discussion of having a stockpile of these vaccines, because this happened in 2009. There was actually a headquarters where, you know, Singapore actually hosted that stockpile, which was funded by Japan, right? But what I'm trying to push is, you know, to really show, and you know, nothing is impossible, is you have pharma companies in the region, and it's if Singapore, if Indonesia and the Philippines, Thailand, for example, who have established pharma companies, actually are able to pool their resources together and make this also, you know, a part of the manufacturing hub of vaccines. I mean, the biggest manufacturer of you know, of vaccines in terms of in numbers is actually India, right? There's no reason why it cannot be done in the region if you actually pool these resources together. And as I said, discussions are being done, and this is where within your AEC, ASEAN Economic Community Framework, your business community can actually sit down through their contacts with, you know, with members in the region. And when you actually look at these initiatives and you sort of link it to the broader, wider regional architecture, I mean, architecture comes in many shapes and forms, right? And I like and I would like to support what Andrew is saying, that, you know, the more, the merrier. I mean, you know, some people talk about, it's so confusing, but you need to be as inclusive as possible and in different shapes and forms, right? So it allows it prevents exclusion, and that's really what you don't like, because especially in our part of the world, where we have smaller countries, you have those that are also developing, you really want to be part of that architecture, where our arrangement or frameworks where this kind of cooperation in areas like health or food, in economics, you really want to be part of that. The thing is to ensure that but also to ensure, but also to ensure that when you have these frameworks that make up this regional architecture, it will also, promote really, the kind of norms that we want, that is ideal in advancing, peace, security, and values like democracy, human rights. This is important because as part of, we all know this, constant interaction generates common interest therefore generates norms. And this is what I think is really needed, especially now in light of a really changed environment. I mean, Dr. Abdul was talking about the new challenges, right? I mean, we haven't even talked about the impact of climate change. We haven't talked about displacement of huge numbers of people. I mean, where are we in the conversation? We'll deal with it one step at a time. So for what it's worth, if you look at some of the ideas that are floating around at the regional level, you name it, ASEAN has it, but it's really in realizing many of these plans that's really worth monitoring.
Well, I think the success of a webinar is indicated by the number of people who stayed. And in fact, what I noticed is that we've seen, in fact, an increase in the number of our participants. So thank you a lot to our panelists. I think this proves that this was quite an interesting topic for everyone. So thank you to our speakers and to our attendees for joining us in today's discussion on emerging trends in the regional environment. I hope that everyone got some new insights from this session. Now I'd like to invite all the participants today to join us again on Monday next week for the second part of this lecture series on norms and international law in ASEAN. Pre-registration for this session is currently ongoing until Sunday, October 11. On behalf of the organizers of the 5th Katipunan Conference, thank you once again to our panelists and attendees for joining us. Stay safe, everyone. Goodbye.